welcome all. I am so delighted that you are here tonight. My name is Griet de Handschutter, and I'm the Executive Director of Acton Boxborough United Way. For those of you who are visually impaired, I am a middle-aged woman. I would describe myself as short graying hair, pink glasses, and wearing a pink sweater and a scarf. We are really delighted to see you all here, and it's an incredible turnout. Thank you for your care about mental health. Acton Boxborough United Way mobilizes the caring power of our community to fight for the health, education, and financial stability of every resident. As mental health for our youth and adolescents is a top priority, we are pleased to host tonight's virtual community conversation and partner with AB Cares to bring you our distinguished guest, Dr. John Campo. A big thank you to our all-volunteer mental health team and their co-chairs, Amy Sorrell and Gory Tandon, and to our virtual tech team, once again, expertly led by Shana Brown. Amy, will you introduce our keynote speaker?
I will be delighted, Griet. Thank you very much. Mental health has long been a priority for Acton Boxborough United Way. We are working to enhance community-based mental health resilience. We are so humbled by tonight's guest speaker. Dr. John Campo is the Leonard and Helen R. Stolman Professor and Director of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University and Vice President of Psychiatric Services at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. He has been honored with the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Simon Weil Leadership and Consultation Award and the National Alliance on Mental Illness Exemplary Psychiatrist Award, and has been on the America's Top Doctors list for 18 years. His interests include suicide prevention, mental health services research, collaborative care for mental disorders in general medical settings, and management of functional somatic symptoms. Dr. Campo has generously given of his time to meet with us and to get to know what would be most valuable for our community.
Hi, I'm Gauri, and I want to give you a sense of the flow of the evening. Following Dr. Campo's remarks, he's ready to address your questions. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A button. Please feel to type your questions there. And if you have questions in Mandarin, please feel free to type it in the chat as well. We would like to thank Shu Fang Lin, who has volunteered to translate questions into English for our speakers. We are also delighted to have two fabulous facilitators for our Q&A. Andrew Shen, who is currently the Director for Special Projects for the AB School District, and known to many of you probably as the former principal of R.J. Gray. And other known member of the Acton community is Vivian Koop Singh J. Burchell, my fellow ABUW United Way board member, and the production and outreach coordinator for ActonTV. Thank you both for being with us. And now, without further ado, Dr. John Campo.
Thank you so much, Gauri. And thank you all. I'm going to do my best to share my screen here and turn this into a for real slideshow here. Here we go. Now, are you able to see the slides properly? I just want to make sure. Thank you. All right. Well, my title for the talk tonight is Turning from Struggle to Strength, and might that be one strategy to prevent suicide? I really wanted to begin by expressing my gratitude for the invitation, for Griet and the entire board of Acton Boxborough United Way. people could not have been more welcoming. It's just been a privilege to be invited to do this and to be here with you tonight. And I hope that the talk is as compelling as how I was treated. I'm also incredibly grateful for my friend John Glazer and his real lifetime of service to children and adolescents. I think you have an amazing child and adolescent psychiatrist right in that community, and I suspect you maybe have more. I was so impressed with the expertise and the thoughtfulness of the board and everyone that I've met so far from your really caring and committed community. So I really thank your community. It's an impressive place. And I really want to thank you all for having a vision, for this vision of trying to turn from struggle to strength. And I was reminded when I was preparing my remarks of a proverb that was, where there is no vision, the people perish. So thank you for all you're doing for your community and the young people there. Disclosures, I really don't have really many of note with regard to this talk. So let me just begin by chatting a little bit about what I hope to talk with you about this evening. First is I'd like to help folks understand a bit about the public health reality of suicide across the lifespan and its disproportionate impact on youth. I want to review a little bit some of the public health challenges that are associated with mental disorders in young people. And I'll want to end up by doing two things. The first is really to examine the concept of resilience and the positive implications of resilience as a way to prevent youth suicide, but also as a way to prevent a lot of negative outcomes across the lifespan. And then probably more towards the time for question and answers, I can review some warning signs associated with suicide risk and some potential management strategies. So that hopefully give folks an idea of what we're going to be chatting about this evening. Let's see here. So let me just begin by talking with you about what we know about suicide, which, if you're like me, I think you will find quite shocking. In 2019, which is the last year with really good data, there were over 47,000 suicide deaths in the United States alone. This is about twice as many suicides as homicides a year in the United States. It's more than twice as many. It's like about 2.5 times as many. Now, suicide's the 10th leading cause of death across the entire lifespan, but it is the second leading cause of death between the ages of 10 and 34. The point I want to make here, particularly given your community's interest in your youth, suicide has a disproportionate impact as a cause of death in younger populations, which makes it particularly shocking from my perspective. Now, what else do we know? I think I'm going to be starting with you with a lot of what I would say is bad news, right? Over the last several decades, the suicide rate in the United States has increased by about 25% in males and females. To give you an idea of where things are at in your state, I thought I'd present data not just for the United States, but tell you a little bit about the states with the highest suicide rates. The single state that has done the worst has been Wyoming. The states with the lowest suicide rates, everybody gives New Jersey a hard time. New Jersey actually has done the best in terms of rate of suicide, but Massachusetts is very close behind. Again, one suicide is too many, but in context, Massachusetts as a state is doing a lot better than several other states out there. So that's something I think you can feel somewhat good about. Now, this slide gives you an idea of the variability you see not by state, but by county. And this is from a paper we had written not that many years ago, where we looked at standardized mortality ratios, which is essentially the observed versus expected deaths related to suicide, where if you have a standardized mortality ratio of less than 1, that's essentially good. It's lower than expected. If it's greater than 1, it's higher than expected. So what you'll see here is this is the United States at what the baseline for this study was back in the period between 1999 and 2001. Again, you see a lot of variability, but this is where we're starting. And we follow it up until the period between 2014 and 2016. And what you'll see is that the standardized mortality ratio has increased in many counties across the United States. And if you look, the areas where the standardized mortality ratios are the highest, the far western states, the Ozarks, the Appalachian chain. But again, you see a tremendous amount of variability. Now, one of the other things that this study allowed us to do is we're able to go through and look at county level suicide rates and look at the correlates of these county level suicide rates. So what did we find when we looked nationally at the county level? What we found is that higher suicide rates were associated with living in a rural residence. Not a big surprise. This is pretty well known, and surprisingly, rural rates are significantly higher than metropolitan rates. It correlated with indices of social deprivation that we constructed for the study, for evidence of social fragmentation, things like higher numbers of single parent families, divorce, family impermanence. Lower population levels of health insurance were also associated with higher suicide rates, as were higher percentage of veterans in the county, as were per capita gun shops. Though that was not a factor in the most rural counties, which were probably already saturated with firearms. Lower suicide rates were associated with what we put together as evidence of social capital. Things like the Acton-Boxborough United Way, evidence of greater philanthropy, greater civic and religious activities in a county. These were protective. And there was also some evidence that that evidence of greater healthcare access was protective as well. Let me see here. I think I have, oh, there we go. Now, I think many of you have heard about what Case and Deaton have described as deaths of despair, which is really their explanation for what has been an unprecedented shift in mortality rates in the United States. Since 1999, for the first time in decades, despite declines in deaths from heart disease and cancer, mortality among middle-aged non-Hispanic whites was noted to go up. And Case and Deaton went and they looked and they said, you know, this was pretty much all explained by what they called deaths of despair. These were deaths from suicide, from drug overdose, and from complications of substance use disorder like liver cirrhosis. They also found that these changes in mortality seemed to track with other social dysfunctions, areas where there was a decline in marriage, problems in the labor force, a decline in religious practice, and greater social isolation. That initial report has been followed by subsequent reports that show that all-cause mortality in the United States in adults has increased across all racial groups, not just among middle-aged whites. And again, explained by the same sorts of things that Case and Deaton referred to as deaths of despair. The point is, something's going on in our culture, and the way Case and Deaton put it, it is related to despair in a very general sense. If you look at accidental overdose deaths, this last year that was measured is shocking. There were over 90,000 drug overdose deaths, ostensibly accidental drug overdose deaths in the United States in 2020. Now, if you look at those, the question is, how many of those deaths were actually suicides? Because it is very difficult to discern volition, whether an overdose is intentional or unintentional. We know that opioid use disorder is associated with increased risk of suicide. And if you think about it, you can imagine a continuum of intent when one takes a lot of drug. One may be on one extreme, the wish to just get as high as possible. On the other extreme, it may be a deliberate suicide attempt. But somewhere in between, there's this continuum where someone may be intensely despairing, not necessarily planning to die by suicide, but feeling bad enough that they're willing to risk death to, quote unquote, feel a little bit better. So this is something that we've wondered about. In the absence of a suicide note, it can be exceptionally difficult to discern when an overdose is deliberate or accidental. Best estimates say that about 20 to 30% of overdose deaths that are classified as accidental are probably suicides. If that's the case, it would add an additional 18,000 suicide deaths each year in the United States at these rates. I wanted to come back and focus now a bit more on youth and the public health reality of not just suicide, but accidents and homicide in young people. A number of years back, I had trained originally as a pediatrician. And, I had the privilege of going back to the Children's Hospital. Actually, John Glazer did some training there as well in Philadelphia. And what I was able to do is I showed him this pie chart here. And what I was able to say is, you see this little slice right here that my cursor is outlining? That's what we learned to take care of when we were pediatric residents at the Children's Hospital. If you look at the rest of the pie chart, that's what kills school-aged children, adolescents, and young adults. Accidents first, suicide second, homicide and violence third. There's a disproportionate impact of these problems, which are all in many respects related to mental disorders, substance use, trauma. So almost 75% of the total of deaths in that age group are from accident, suicide, or violence. And if you look, suicide is responsible for about 1 in 5 of these deaths. I don't know about you. I talk about this all the time, but that just shocks me, and it continues to shock me. 1 in 5 school-aged children and adolescents who die by suicide. Almost 7,000 a year more recently. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about COVID, but if there was an infectious disease out there that was killing almost 7,000 school-aged children and adolescents a year, our emergency departments would look terribly different than they do now. Our systems of healthcare would look terribly different than they do now. Suicide kills more young people than cancer, infections of all kinds, heart disease, respiratory illness, congenital anomalies. Add them all together, suicide kills more young people. Again, shocking. So let me talk a little bit more about some of the factors associated with suicide risk that'll frame our later discussions. First is age. What we know is that suicide rates do tend to increase with increasing age. Very young children have been known to kill themselves, though it is quite rare before age 10. The highest suicide rates by age are in older people, but again, disproportionate cause of death in youngers. Sex, important. Males kill themselves at least 3 times or more often than females. Though one of the things that some of our recent work has shown is that that male to female ratio has been decreasing over time. The point being that females, young females, tend to be choosing more and more violent and potentially lethal methods, most notably hanging or suffocation. And if you look at these curves here, you'll see that the suicide rates for girls are getting, they're less of a multiple than for males. Other factors, demographic factors associated with heightened suicide risk, Native American heritage, white, non-Hispanic, and then as you go down the list, Hispanic, Black, and Asian. Now, one of the things that our group did find is that if you look across the lifespan, there are some differences with age. And I think for the first time, we've found over the last decade or so that for younger kids, for kids who are pre-adolescents, that the suicide rate in Blacks was significantly higher than the suicide rate in whites. And when we looked carefully at it, we remain puzzled by it. But for younger kids, suicide rates in Blacks are higher than whites. And then something happens around age 12 or 13 where things flip back to the way that it looks across the lifespan, where the suicide rate in whites is significantly higher. Why this is, we don't know. It may have something to do with there being maybe differences in pre-adolescent suicide. Might it be related more towards trauma, impulsivity, this sort of thing? We just don't know, but it is something that we are looking into and care about deeply, particularly since over time, just as with females, quote unquote, catching up with males, what we're finding is that suicide rates in Blacks and other underserved groups are increasing disproportionately. And that seems to be particularly true during the pandemic. Now, other health factors associated with heightened suicide risk, mental disorders. Over 90% of completed suicides, if you do psychological autopsies, are associated with a mental disorder, and these are potentially remediable risk factors for suicide. The more disorders you have, the greater the risk. Neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, intellectual, and other developmental disabilities associated with heightened suicide risk. What do we know about mental disorders? I mean, this is a crowd that I'll say, well, what do we mean? We mean that we're talking about individuals who suffer from disturbances of emotion, thought, and or behavior that's associated with some degree of disability or impairment. The disorders are highly prevalent. Mental disorders affect about 20% or more of the population at any one time. At any one time, 4 to 5% of adults are seriously mentally ill and impaired. These disorders are more prevalent in the physically ill and the Medicaid insured. Alcohol and substance use disorders affect almost 10% of the population. And again, neurodevelopmental disorders. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that these disorders typically begin early in life. About 50% of serious mental disorders have had their onset by age 14. Again, this is one of the reasons why we are so focused on youth. 75% of serious mental disorders have their onset by young adulthood, by age 24. Why are these disorders important in addition to their being risk factors for suicide? Well, these young people, they suffer, they're impaired, they're disabled. It's a major driver of unemployment and poverty. These disorders have negative effects on physical health. They increase the risk of experiencing trauma or adversity. And again, they increase mortality risk for both suicide, accidents, and violence. Related to mental disorders, intimately related in a lot of ways, are adverse childhood experiences. What do we mean by that? We mean potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. Some examples: experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect as a child, witnessing violence in the home, death or loss of a family member, parental separation, divorce, incarceration, living with a parent or another family member who suffers from a mental or a substance use disorder. These are some examples. Now, what is also worth noting is that adverse childhood experiences are quite common. 2/3 of us have had at least one adverse childhood experience. This is in the water for us as human beings. 1 of 6 adults, about 16% of us, have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And the more of these experiences we have, the more at risk we are across the lifespan for a variety of problems, not just mental and substance use disorders, but chronic health issues and early death. Problems with education, problems with work, problems with earning potential. And also, the more adverse childhood experiences you have come your way, the more likely it is that subsequent generations that are associated with you will be exposed to these negative events as well. And again, also associated with increased risk of accident, suicide, and violence. These events, they can be predisposing to things like suicide, but they can also be precipitating events as well. Physical health conditions also increase the risk of suicide, some more than others, particularly those that affect the brain. Traumatic brain injury, epilepsy being quite notable. Misuse of alcohol and drugs, again, major risk factors for suicide. Both acute use and chronic use can increase risk. One of the things that our group did was we looked at youth in the United States who were enrolled in Medicaid. And we looked carefully at the whole notion of suicide risk in this population. Again, any mental health diagnosis was associated with risk, substance use, physical health conditions, particularly epilepsy. Other risk factors for suicide, well, anyone will tell you the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? Well, certainly previous suicide attempts, deliberate self-harm, certainly risk factors for death by suicide. Except there are some important things to remember. Most individuals who attempt suicide do not die by suicide. And the ratio of attempts to completions is probably at least 25-1. If you look at young people in particularly who have attempted suicide, over 90% of them will not die by suicide ultimately. They'll die from something else. The flip side, though, which in many respects is even more troubling, is most young people, most people across the lifespan who die by suicide die on the very first attempt, which makes it critically important for us to try and prevent first attempts, to identify people at risk and prevent suicide. Family history can be important. But another major risk factor is sexual minority status, LGBTQ, and also early sexual abuse seems to be associated with heightened risk. I think many of us talk about concerns related to suicide contagion. I bring this up partly because it was an area of interest. Our group was one of the groups that associated the Netflix release of the series 13 Reasons Why with an increase in the adolescent suicide rate. Another group, Nieder Krotenthaler's group, found essentially the same thing. But what both groups found, and what I think other studies have shown, is that compared to adults, youth are much more susceptible to contagion, to being influenced by exposure to suicide, either in their own lives, in the media, in fiction and drama as well. And again, this just gives you, the red line is essentially the suicide rate by month in the year that 13 Reasons Why came out compared to many other years previous. Firearms, again, a huge risk for suicide. Access to lethal means is important. About half of suicides in the United States are firearm related. I think that right behind is suffocation, and again, increasingly a problem in girls. Firearm suicide is much more associated with death on the first attempt, as you might imagine. Transitional times in the life of young people: discharge from a psychiatric unit, discharge from the ED, release from jail or prison. All of these things increase the risk of suicide. And again, we know that individuals who present in physical healthcare settings are at heightened risk compared to those who do not, which makes those settings somewhat appealing as a way to prevent suicide. So let's talk for just a moment here about COVID as a potential risk factor for suicide. This may well be a physical health and a mental health crisis that we're dealing with, but we just don't know at this point. What's different about the pandemic? A lot more in the way of social isolation for young people, decreased community support, decreased peer support, school and work closures, disruptions to the health service system, and then stresses in families, COVID-related grief and trauma, and perhaps even the effects of COVID on the brain itself. Now, what's also true is the pandemic has, in some respects, also activated some pro-social behaviors and brought people a little bit closer in other respects. So we don't know how this is all going to pan out. We do know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on minority populations and on individuals who come from families with essential workers and who have family members who are unpaid caregivers. We also know that people who are already vulnerable to mental disorders and substance use disorders were at the greatest risk. And we know that demand for mental health and addiction crisis services has been increasing. Now, there are certainly some protective factors: connectedness, social engagement, the presence of others, religious commitment, religious faith, a sense of purpose, core values, beliefs, the ability to plan for the future. And then coming from a family that's motivated to do better, that's motivated towards healing, and also living in a culture with some meaningful taboos against the act of suicide, as opposed to talking about suicide. So let me begin and say, well, there is some good news. I've really laid a lot of bad news on your community, but there is some good news. There are proven suicide prevention strategies. We know that suicide rates are negatively correlated with indicators of access to health and behavioral health services. And we also increasingly know and believe and act as if access to services is critical to prevention efforts. And I do believe that is the case. Unfortunately, there are some problems which will lead us into our discussion about thinking about resilience on a population-based level. First is that most people at risk for suicide are unrecognized. They're under the radar. They're the part of the iceberg that you can't see. Most individuals at risk for suicide receive no treatment, and of those who do, they more often than not receive inadequate treatment. Best practices often aren't followed. There are tremendous discontinuities between levels of care. And as I mentioned before, most suicide decedents die the first time they try. Most discouraging of all, despite a lot of efforts for decades, suicide rates continue to rise despite existing prevention efforts, which leads me to wonder, and has led other smart people, smarter people than me, to wonder whether there's something that's happening where perhaps something's different in terms of how resilient we are as individuals in our culture. Now, I guess one of the things that I put out there, and it's implicit in much of what I've said, is that we don't think about suicide like we think about other public health problems, right? I think one of the things that we don't do is think about it quite that way. If you look at your emergency department, it has all these specialized services. Services for individuals at risk for suicide are more or less an afterthought, quite honestly. We are thinking about it maybe in a way that's not as productive as it could be. There are a lot of barriers to care out there. We all know about structural barriers to care, but we know that there are also a lot of attitudinal barriers to care. We find mental disorders can disrupt their own treatment. We think about dealing with mental disorders and the stresses in our life as very differently than we do thinking about dealing with things like diabetes or asthma. And there's a tremendous amount of stigma. Stigma is less now than it was many years back, but it remains an important issue in our lives. Now, when we think about suicide and studying suicide prevention, there are a lot of research challenges that certainly do present themselves. First is that most of the data we have on suicide is observational. It's not experimental data. And so it's vulnerable to confounding. We can make the mistake of just thinking, well, gee, is living, I told you before that New Jersey has the lowest rate of suicide. Well, does being born in New Jersey, is that really protective? Probably not. There are other things going on that confound how we think about data that's observational. The very low base rate of suicide makes study difficult. You need huge sample sizes to examine an outcome of interest like suicide, which leads us to rely on proxy variables, suicidal thinking, suicide attempts, this sort of thing, which are useful, but not quite the same. If you think about it, females make way more suicide attempts than males in adolescence, and yet males die by suicide, the outcome of interest, at least about 3 times as much. as females. So what do we know? We know suicide's a complex, multi-determined problem, which means that probably multifaceted solutions and interventions are going to be needed. When we think about prevention, we can think about a number of things. We can target individuals at risk. We call those indicated strategies. We can target groups at risk for suicide, which we call selective strategies. And we can take a population-wide approach, which we call a universal strategy, right? Now, we can talk about these things as if they're targeting individuals, risk groups, or the population at large. But the reality is a lot of these strategies overlap. For example, means restriction can be relevant at the individual level or the population level as a means of preventing suicide or violence. What do we know? And I'm not going to go into detail for this group in terms of all the different data that's out there about what we know about what can prevent suicide. But if you look at the individual level, things like careful safety planning have been shown to reduce the risk of death by suicide and suicide attempts. There are specific psychotherapies that have developed that are suicide-specific interventions that have been shown in controlled trials to be protective. If you look at the population level, there's some reason to think that antidepressant treatment may be protective. And then in specific populations, like individuals with bipolar illness, lithium seems to have a specific anti-suicide effect, as does the drug clozapine in individuals who suffer from psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. There's a lot of research going on right now on trying to develop treatments that can rapidly decrease suicidality. Things like ketamine and esketamine are being studied with some promise. And other interventions that we've used for some time now, particularly ECT, even though they've not been studied in randomized controlled trials as a means of preventing suicide. Certainly, a lot of clinicians will tell you that they can be life-saving in certain circumstances. Now, there are a variety of other strategies where you can target at-risk groups. I'll just throw out a few examples. Screening for suicide risk in emergency departments for young people. Again, it's been shown to be potentially a way to reduce future attempts and suicide. Unfortunately, most EDs don't do this, and most EDs don't have any specialty mental health services in order to respond if they did identify individuals at risk. Training gatekeepers, people in the community, to identify individuals at risk and who know how to maybe direct them to services or can do some things that can be helpful in the short term. Simple things like maintaining connectedness for individuals at suicide risk. People have shown that things like sending a postcard can be protective. Mental health follow-ups within 7 days of discharge from an ED or an inpatient unit can actually prevent completed suicide. Simple things that can make a big difference. Thinking universally means restriction. And there are a whole variety of examples, one of them being gun safety and control efforts. Enhanced awareness and education about suicide, which is one of the things that I'm hoping that I'm doing now with your community, which is already, I think, a quite informed community. But there's some reason to believe that these kind of efforts can be protective at the population level. Again, increasing access to care, preventing trauma and serious adversity, particularly preventing adverse childhood experiences, may very well be a way of preventing suicide. A whole variety of examples are out there. But then finally, and the place where I do want to finish up, is the whole idea of how do you foster health, well-being, and resilience, particularly in young people. Some examples would be, how do you strengthen family bonds and attachments? How do you improve social support? How do you instill a sense of purpose in young people and help them to be able to plan for the future? So what we're talking about, and this is what your board has been so committed to, is how do we change the narrative and maybe change the focus from focusing on what's wrong with folks to how can we focus more on health? How can we have a more of a positive psychology approach? When we think about health, the World Health Organization describes it as more than just the absence of illness or disease. It's a state of physical, mental, and social well-being. Behavioral wellness, it's a state of emotional, cognitive, and behavioral well-being that allows people to really realize their potential, to cope with typical stress, to work productively, and to contribute to community. And that is relevant not just for individuals, but for families and for communities. So let's talk for a moment a bit about resilience. What is it, right? Well, resilience is that ability for us to adapt, to withstand, or to recover successfully in the face of threat, in the face of adversity, in the face of trauma. It's essentially our human ability to bend without breaking. Now, an important point that I would make is that resilience does not require being free of distress. One can be quite resilient and adaptive while at the same time not being free of all distress, okay? Resilience can be thought of both as a trait and also as an outcome. It's not simply a constitutional trait. A lot of times if we think cross-sectionally, we think, okay, person A is more or less resilient than person B. And there may be both genetic and acquired factors that lead that to be the case. But there's a longitudinal component to resilience where resilience can be acquired. It can also be learned. And what I'd also say is that, yes, there do appear to be genetic differences in individuals that make some of us at greater risk to respond negatively to adversity. What's also true and often easily forgotten is that those same vulnerabilities may make those same people more responsive to respond in a really thriving way in positive environments. So it's a very complex thing that's going on with risk and resilience. Is there an iterative relationship between resilience and adversity? Seems to be. The frequency and severity of adversity matter. If you think about it, I mean, experiencing overwhelming adversity can really interfere with resilience. Early childhood experience can alter a development, can have long-lasting effects on how individuals respond to stress or adversity. It can be crippling. It can make it more difficult for people to respond to distress. It can make them less resilient. On the other hand, we also know that resilience can be fostered by controlled exposures to manageable challenges or stresses. That can be an active process. And what I'd also say is that pure avoidance is unlikely to foster resilience. It may protect you from being traumatized, but it does not necessarily foster or help you develop greater degrees of resilience. And I bring this up because this is something that we talked about a lot with your board and for Acton Boxborough United Way. That parenting, that mentoring, that being a coach, there are challenges associated with it. We wear two hats as parents, right? One hat is the protector hat, and the other hat is a life coach hat. Both are important, but we have to remember that both are important. And this curve, I think, is a way of maybe conceptualizing it. This is a curve about human performance, and people refer to it as the inverted U-shaped curve. What does it show? Is that as, say, pressure in a system, as stress in a system increases, what you find is that most individuals, as pressure increases, you get an increase in the level of performance, where it peaks out somewhere with the quote unquote right degree of pressure. But then with increasing pressure in the system, there comes a decrement. Our systems poop out, they become overwhelmed. And this is true for us across our lifespan. And it's true particularly for young people. So really, as a life coach, we want to get people to figure out how they can perform at the highest level, while at the same time protecting them from crossing over to the point where there's a decrement and potential ongoing damage. A quote that I found incredibly helpful in thinking about my own life as a parent, and in my work, including as a mentor, is a quote from Goethe. And what does Goethe say? He says, if we take people as they are, we make them worse. If we treat them as if they were what they ought to be, we help them become what they are capable of becoming. So how do we foster resilience? And I think that I'm going to just stop shortly, but certainly helping individuals to make better social connections and protect relationships, supportive relationships with family, with friends, in the community, by helping them cultivate a sense of hope, optimism, humor, and positive affect, which for some of us like me, I am not an optimist by nature. I've had to work on that over the course of my lifespan. But these are positive things to attempt to cultivate. Promoting self-awareness, the ability to clarify life goals and values. Faith and spirituality for many of us can mean a whole lot, a sense of calling, a sense of purpose, the ability to love what we do and to engage in the activities that we do in a way where nothing else seems to matter. What Seligman talks about as flow, and cultivating flow can be helpful and protective. And finally, the opportunity to reframe adversity, right? We always think about adversity as bad, right? Well, you know, sometimes when we think about stress, perhaps we can think about it more as akin to exercise for us. Is there a way for us to develop what William Osler, the great physician, called a sense of imperturbability, which allows us to train ourselves to cope better in challenging situations? If you think about the medical setting, none of us are wired to be in the middle of an intensive care unit in the middle of the night. You have to prepare yourself to get there, and not just in terms of the skill set per se, but emotionally as well. And you know, do we reframe our losses less as losses than as a remembrance of people and things that we loved? So reframing adversity can be helpful. And again, your grandmother will tell you, attending to the basics of self-care matters. I can't emphasize it enough. Nutrition, healthy eating, incredibly important. Physical activity and exercise, sleep, a regular schedule, other healthy pleasures, and solitude. Can't recommend them enough, and none of us pay enough attention to them, myself included. So finally, how am I going to conclude here? Well, first, we all know suicide is a catastrophic and a refractory source of mortality that disproportionately affects young people. Most people who die by suicide are unrecognized or untreated, and they die in the first attempt. And that makes me think we have to find a better way than what we've been doing. We know that access to care is associated with decreased suicide rates, and we have a number of prevention strategies for individuals at risk, but most often these aren't applied with the most vulnerable people. Finally, the point that I'd end with is that perhaps enhancing child and family resilience may be an important approach, not just to preventing youth suicide, but preventing a lot of other negative consequences across the lifespan, and preventing additional human suffering, not just in the individuals themselves, but in their offspring and family members. So I am going to stop there and thank you for your attention. I'm sorry to go on a little bit longer than I had hoped. And then in a moment, we can maybe talk a bit more if there are specific questions about recognizing people at risk for suicide. So I will stop here and turn things over to the moderator.
John, do you have to take down your slides?
Oh, I will. I apologize. Yes, let me take that down. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yes.
And Andrew and Vivian, are you ready? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Campo. Before I introduce our student who's going to kick off the question and answer section, I just want to provide a friendly reminder for those who want to submit a question. You can do so in the Q&A box. And then if someone who submitted a question, you are also curious about that topic, we'd encourage you to use the thumbs up icon just to emphasize that that's a question that you also would appreciate some attention to. So with that, I'm going to introduce Zainab Garalnabi. Zainab is a student at the high school, and there you are. I think you want to kick us off with a question, Zainab?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. John. It was really great to listen to your presentation, especially as like a student. I felt like I saw a different side of it, so I'm very excited. My question to you is just like, as a student who struggles with like a lot of just like academic, I guess, stress, and just a lot of, I guess AB is a pretty competitive school academically. How do you try to deal with that and just also like reach out? How do you reach out?
Okay, these are great questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Zainab, and to ask some questions. One of the things that I can show you in a little bit is I do have some slides that maybe can help you around the whole idea of reaching out. You know, you're really speaking to the challenge of human existence and the challenge of being an adolescent, right? You have demands put on you, right? That's not all bad. The question is, how do you balance those demands and respond to them in a way that's healthy for you? And if we go back and we think about some of the things that we talked about, part of it involves self-care, right? Most of us aren't very good at self-care. Most of us kind of have this idea that it's somehow shameful for us to care for ourselves, but that is by no means the case. And you know, there's a great quote from Shakespeare. I think it's Henry V. It's something like self-love, my liege, is not so foul a sin as self-neglect, you know. So we need to take care of ourselves. And I guess I'd ask you, how do you typically do that for you?
I usually like going on runs and also
Yeah.
just reading. That helps.
Well, lot of good evidence out there that physical exercise in and of itself can be protective, right? It helps us manage stress. It helps us function better, not worse. It decreases inflammation and improves mood. Getting regular sleep, a regular schedule. These are things that are positive. And as corny as it sounds, everybody tells you about nutrition. Eating a healthy diet, avoiding caffeine, some of the energy drinks, eating junk food. These things certainly can be helpful as well. I recommend to a lot of young people something as simple as taking a multivitamin every day, paying attention to vitamin D, particularly if you live in a place like Massachusetts, which especially this time of year doesn't have a lot of sunlight. And then, there's not a tremendous amount of data, but there's some reason to think that things like taking fish oil regularly might be helpful as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Vivian, I know you found some questions. Do you want to ask one of the ones you've been looking at?
Yeah, so I'll say, and now we're going to proceed with the audience questions through the chat. And if you're more comfortable formulating your questions in Mandarin, it's a reminder, please add your question in the chat and a volunteer is ready to translate it to English. And you can add your question with your name or anonymously. So just to kick us off, once parents know what is needed to build resilience in our kids, Dr. Campo, what steps can we take to teach it to our children?
Yeah, well, I think the first step is really just being available and communicating with them. That sounds easy. When I think back to my own kids, oftentimes they don't always come forward when they're struggling. They, just like we want to protect them, they often want to protect us. So the first part is finding a way to engage with them. Again, it sounds maybe corny and old-fashioned, but something as simple as having family meals, making sure that people sit around the dinner table once a day at least, hugely helpful, hugely important. And the more busy, the more stressed we are as parents, the less likely we are to do that sort of thing. So I think trying to deliberately set time aside to be together as a family is probably step one.
Andrew, do you want to take the next question?
Yeah, John, I just saw a question that actually goes to the slide around that sort of perpetual tension between being a life coach and a protector for your kid, which is that it's always that push and pull. And so this question is, I totally agree that at the adolescent stage, parents are more of a life coach role, but with peer pressure, social media, and school culture, I often feel powerless. So I'm assuming perhaps this is a parent or a guardian. Yeah. Do you have any practical advice on how to be a life coach?
Oh boy, the first part of the advice is it's easier to give advice than it is to live it. So I share this individual struggle about how do you balance wanting to be a protector and being a successful life coach. The first thing is sort of knowing your kids. That's probably critical. And I think that knowing what your particular child at that time is capable of managing and tolerating on their own. That's not the same as what they think they're capable of tolerating though, right? Because, a lot of kids, they're anxious, they're worried. I mean, my kids came by their anxiety, honestly. And so, I had a couple of kids who were really socially anxious. The idea of calling and ordering a pizza drove them crazy. And so, of course, that was something that I always asked them to do, not when they were really little, but when they were old enough to do it. So how do you help them stretch enough it's kind of like training an athlete, right? What does a coach do with an athlete? You don't have them run a marathon the first day that they come out for cross country practice. You bring them along. You want them to stretch, but you don't want them to stretch too much that they aren't able to rebound. It's probably the best I can do with it. I don't know, Andrew. I don't know if you have any better advice as an educator, right? It's a tall order finding the sweet spot.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of it's always a push and a pull. And
now, what I will say to that though is, I don't think we've ever lived in a time that is more where people have talked about resilience more than we talk about it now. And there's a part of me that worries we talk about it more and we're less good at being resilient.
Yeah.
And so we've gone, I don't know, when I was a little kid, the overall zeitgeist, there were a lot of stressors in school. Bullying existed then, but the zeitgeist from my parents anyway was, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Now, names can hurt plenty, but that was, the mindset. We've evolved now to a mindset where we think about things like trigger warnings, which, again, there are some times where you do want to be protective, but we have to be careful what the meta communication of our protectiveness is. The last thing we want to do is send a message to our kids that we think that they're that they lack the capability to rise to a challenge, right? And so I think there is some of that in I think perhaps the pendulum is swung a little too far towards protection, which is maybe why I want to emphasize that a little bit. Want to treat kids like they're capable of. I would rather see somebody fail by asking their kid to do a little bit too much than to continually ask them to do less.
Well, the other question that is, related to my line of work, I'm in media, and we have this thing called social media that,
Yes.
That young kids now are addicted to. It's hard to say we can keep them away from it. And, the person in the chat asks, what role does social media play in increasing rates of suicide?
Yeah.
So
it's a wonderful and important question that we don't fully know the answer to, right? A lot of the suicide risk studies that were done previously, some of the psychological autopsy studies, very detailed, very helpful. They were conducted most if not all of them before the age of social media, and there's probably reason for us to think a little bit about how do we do that now? How do we look at the risk associated with social media? We know that it can't all be good, but it's like a lot of things. There may be ways that social media, look at during the pandemic, social media, telemedicine has been hugely helpful to a lot of people. At the same time, there can be a lot of negatives associated with it. So again, it's like, how do you balance it for your kids? How do you know what your kids are best at tolerating? How do you know what to expose them to and when? So I think social media can be a risk. There's a lot we don't know still, though. We all think about it as potentially contributing to increased rates of suicide, but we don't know for sure. We certainly know that some of these dramatic exposures, things like 13 Reasons Why, things that romanticize or really dramatize suicide or romanticize it, can be quite harmful.
John, a question that just came in that I actually am really excited by, and and I have my own answer, and I'm hoping you have the same answer.
Yeah.
Does it help to show your own vulnerability as a parent?
I think the answer is, of course, yes. I mean, I think that I think it's one thing to be able to show one's vulnerability as a parent. I don't think that's the same as showing one's incompetence or impotence as a parent. Those are different. So I think that to be able to put things in human terms and to be able to talk with our kids about our own strengths and weaknesses in an honest way, I think it's a potentially useful and healthy thing. What I'd say, and I this is true for me, not just as a parent, but in my work professionally, and I would imagine in your work as an educator as well. There are times where I'm quite willing to share some of my own vulnerabilities and history with people. But the measure for me is to really do some self-reflection, and am I sharing that information for the young person, or am I doing it for me? If I'm doing it for me, they should, I should be sending them a check, right? But I think that I think that's the measure for me. If I really can conceptualize it as being helpful, I think it's fine within reason. Do you agree?
I do. I think
good.
you said it well, where, the modeling sort of the willingness to name things that aren't always easy, that sometimes things take practice, things takes time, or that things are messy and that you have to wrestle with them, I think is good modeling. But to your point, there's a fine line between that and sort of kind of just using it as your own therapeutic session to a young person probably isn't the healthiest approach. But
there are a lot of bumps in the, it's like, there are a lot of bumps in the road, and I'm going to treat you as somebody who's capable of weathering the bumps.
Right.
And, let me tell you about a few bumps that I've
my own, right.
All right, so the next question, I'm going to join two questions because they are related. We have a parent who says, they lost their 10-year-old to suicide.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And ask what is appropriate for elementary schools to do to serve as a basis for suicide prevention. And the other one, closely tied to it, is a question about peer-to-peer support.
Yes.
When do peers need to ask for help, even against what their friends request for anonymity? How can we build these structures?
Well, again, I am so sorry for that family. This question about when do you begin suicide prevention efforts? What I'd say is one of the appealing things about thinking about ways to foster individual resilience, this is something that we can begin from day one, right? From infancy. The question, though, I think is, when should we start thinking about things like screening for suicide risk, right? We know that there are certainly pre-adolescent children, some very young, even some preschoolers who experience suicidal thoughts and at times suicidal behaviors. Death by suicide is exceptionally rare below age 10. Doesn't mean it doesn't occur, and any death in that, it's catastrophic. The question is, what's the value of doing things like screening? What's the value of doing things like education? Where does educating, is there an age at which, talking, is there an age where children are too young to talk with them about suicide? We don't really know. I don't think anyone has done careful studies with pre-adolescent kids about, is screening protect? I mean, we don't know even if routine screening by itself really is protective in terms of reducing the suicide rate. It stands to reason because you want to recognize those individuals at risk. So the answer about 10-year-olds is we don't know. What we do know is that oftentimes, if you look at young children who die by suicide, there are certainly some of them who are depressed, but compared to adolescence, where depression is increasingly an issue, in the younger kids, things like impulsive suicide attempts are much more common. There's an argument or a disciplinary thing that happens, and a child sort of impulsively does something lethal. So there are probably differences in kind for very young children who die by suicide. There's more of a tendency towards impulsivity, but it doesn't mean that in general. I mean, there's certainly plenty of impulsive attempts later in life, but the ratio is a little different. Did I miss the second part of your question?
Well, it was about peer-to-peer support.
Yeah.
It's still part of the school system.
Yeah. Certainly peer support is helpful. The thing that's important is, particularly with, and not just with really young kids, but with adolescents and sometimes even young adults, without our educating them, one can be easily confounded by confidentiality, right? So what's the biggest concern that I have with peer-to-peer support is that some peers will feel an inordinate obligation to protect the confidentiality of their friends. Whereas those of us who are a little bit older, it's like, listen, you know what? Yeah, you took that bottle of pills a couple days ago. Yeah, I'm glad you didn't die, but I think we need to talk. I think you need to talk to your parents. And if you don't, I think I have to. I'm sorry. Most young people, that's a tall order. That's a tall order for many adults. I have to get after residents sometimes to step outside of the confidential frame. So I think peer-to-peer support is helpful, but it's more helpful with peers who have been trained. And there are actually a number of school-based programs that do this. These signs of suicide curriculum, they actually do seem to be helpful and protective, but it involves helping kids to have a better sense of what to ask, what to do, who to talk to, that sort of thing.
John, the next question that popped up that I'd love to ask, and I'm interested in asking more as a representation of sort of, again, this challenge in parenting of how do you sort of right size your sort of response or reaction to an observation of certain behaviors. And so here's the question, and then we can get into it. If my kid is only interested in video games and chatting online and not interested in anything else, is this a symptom of depression? And so I think for me, there's always, again, like, you're a parent and you're observing certain tendencies and they might be leaning a certain way. Where is that point where a certain type of tendency or behavior in your child would be a cause for concern, as opposed to sort of our own kind of just worries as a parent?
Right. Well, a couple things. I think to take it in a general way and think about what are some things that help us recognize if a son or a daughter is at risk or is maybe struggling with a mental disorder or a substance use problem. First is, how do they compare to their baseline? Are their emotions seemingly disordered? Do they seem more grouchy, more irritable? Do they look more sad, more down? Do they appear more anxious to us as parents? If we're thinking it, in all likelihood, it's worth attending to. Is there a change in their cognition? Are they less attentive? Are they having trouble concentrating? Are they more indecisive? Are they complaining of a lot of physical complaints? Fatigue, headaches, stomach aches, sleep problems? Is their attitude different? Are they less motivated? Are they less compassionate than you know them to be? Are they more pessimistic than they previously were? Have they lost that sense of idealism, become more cynical? These can be clues to something happening. And I always encourage parents to be reluctant to just chalk things up to this is quote unquote normal adolescence. If you're concerned about it, if there's a distinct change in your child, it's probably worth attending to. Probably one of the biggest clues is a decline in performance at school. You know, if there are plenty of kids who are depressed and able to work through it, but if you have a child who's otherwise been performing reasonably well academically and socially, who starts to fall off the curve, that's a big red flag. More interpersonal conflict, any reason to be concerned about use of alcohol or drugs, and then social isolation. So plenty of kids that, you know, I mean, plenty of kids love to play video games. The question is compared to what their baseline was and compared to what you think is reasonable as a parent, you know, it is okay. I mean, how to put it? I've often, the older I get, the more I find myself doing this. And I think there's something in the water about it, but I found myself sometimes having to say to some kids and some families that, you know, seems like folks here have forgotten the first rule of childhood. And people say, well, what's the first rule of childhood? The first rule of childhood is the adults are in charge. And, you know, sometimes parents actually have judgments worth making. If you think your child is spending way too much time in front of a screen, maybe they are. And I think you can trust your judgment, and they don't always have to be happy with your judgments. I remember my mother basically kicking me out of my room, and I wasn't very good at baseball, but I sure as heck liked to read, and it was like, get out! I'm locking you out. You're going to play baseball. You know, that was it.
Thank you. The next question, again, I see two questions that are kind of related. One is asking, much of the stress that our young people experience come from worry about their future. How important is it to instill in our children the importance of here and now, enjoying learning in the present? And this is a little similar to another one that is talking about two kids. This parent has two children, 5 and 8, that are hard on themselves when they feel they've made a mistake and they speak negatively about themselves. So again, it's that same uncertainty about their future themselves. So how do you distinguish when this is normal behavior versus behavior of concern?
I mean, I think certainly I have to do this with myself, is discourage self-deprecating negative language, you know. I think that just as we want to train our children to be kind to their peers, to be kind to the adults in their lives, we also want to train them to develop a sense of kindness towards themselves, which can be a taller order for some of us. I do think that there's much to be said about having high standards. There's much to be said to having a sense of purpose, a sense of calling. But I think that that has to be balanced with a sense of humility and a sense of an appreciation of our frailty as human beings. And I think that with kids, I oftentimes will remind them, and the conversations that, well, gee, I'm hearing you say this, and that about yourself. How would you respond if your good friend Joe was saying those kind of things about themselves? What would you think? Oftentimes they would, that gets their attention. It's like, gee, I would say, gee, why would you be so negative about yourself, Joe? Well, you sounds like you're better at being kind to your friend than you are being kind to yourself. Why is that, do you think? So I think that parents want to have high standards, but they also want to foster their own sense of compassion towards their kids and their kids' ability to be compassionate towards themselves. So it's a both and. Again, it's like training an athlete. You want them to train hard. You don't want them to train themselves into injury. How's that?
John, I think we have maybe time for one more question that I'm looking at right here. I don't know if this is an easy one to answer or if it's a more complicated one. Do you believe more that adolescent anxiety is on the rise or that adolescent resilience is waning?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it might be difficult to even say that adolescent anxiety is on the rise. I think that one can make a case during the pandemic that there's certainly been an increase in self-reports of anxiety during the pandemic. I would hate, I guess, even if I believe that resilience was on the decline, I would be hesitant to say that because I think it's a really negative metacommunication. I think that what people need to understand is that I think we're wired pretty similarly to how we were wired not that long ago. And I think that we certainly are quite capable of resilience. I'm not convinced that aside from the pandemic that that emotional disorders are exceedingly more common. There's some reason to believe that anxiety and depression are a bit more prevalent since, say, the time of the Second World War in subsequent generations. But those are hard. Those are really hard questions to answer in a credible way scientifically.
Great. I think we just hit the 8:30 mark, so Greta,
Well, yes. And with that, I would like to thank you, John, for this amazing evening. I think we all will have our own takeaways of the event. I think the emphasis of kindness and compassion and being compassionate towards yourself and teaching your kids compassion. I thought you're at the end saying, if you're good, if your good friend would say that, what would you think? It's a very good way of looking at it. And I am a born optimist, so of course I believe that we are wired, and that I really hope that you are right, that we're quite capable of resilience, and that's also why we wanted to invite you. And I think you've given an enormous amount of very practical strategies and tips, and the issue of confidentiality versus no, at some point your life is more important than that what you think is at that moment perhaps the most important. So thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you to the team. Thank you to all the participants to come back on Zoom in the evening to listen and to hear.
Yeah, it's one great. Thank you. And I worry that perhaps I tried to get a little too broad for folks, but I'm so touched that people took time out of their evening to have this dialogue, and I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to just congratulate you and your group for all the good that you're doing, and that I know you're going to continue to do there. So my very best. It's a privilege to get to meet you all, and thanks for having me.
Thank you and good night to everyone. And we will be back. We have still a couple of more events coming. And so one was gatekeeper training. And so that is actually something that we have is the AB Cares Coalition that includes schools and police, faith communities. It's free training. Sign up this time for the first time in person, but others we will be alternating between in person and Zoom. And it is really an incredibly good training to help recognize signs for potential suicide prevention. Then we have with NAMI Central Middlesex on Monday, March the 21st, a big information session, always great panel on college and mental health of your kids or youth. So thank you all. And we will follow up with an email with resources later this week. And I hope it was a good evening, a good night. Thank you. And we will connect.